Morning decisions. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
I wrote a little song to remind you, Choice Hotels get you more of the experiences you value. The Cambria Hotel's got it all. A rooftop bar, have a ball. Cocktails up here feel just right. Is Cambria amazing? All right. Bring a date, your team, or even your mom. Book direct at choicehotels.com. See you on the roof.
Hi, Nat Doig here, and just a heads up that today's episode does include a brief reference in a ghost story to animal cruelty and domestic violence. Welcome to Weird in the Wade, a podcast about all that's weird, wonderful, and a little off-kilter in the town of Biggleswade and its surrounding area. Whether you like your history with a pinch of the paranormal, or your paranormal stories with historical context, this is the show for you. Whether it's the tale of haunted Houghton house, or the Glen Miller mystery, or maybe Victorian murder mysteries are your thing, make yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax while I take you on a journey into the weird. It's March 1923. An anonymous article appears on page 2 of the Bedfordshire Times and Independent in the local news section. This article is different to all the others on that page. It appears above a story about the health benefits of Bovril. There was a Bovril factory in Ampthill, so I guess that's why it was considered local news. But our strange and anonymous news story is also next to columns devoted to the news in Ampthill, Aspley Guys, through to Clophill, Maldon and Woburn Sands, to name a few of the villages covered. These news stories are about the ladies' cricket team at Cranfield, the sad news that Mrs. Reynolds of Richmond has been buried, and William Coles, postmaster of Ampthill, is to retire. It's the kind of news that would not raise an eyebrow over toast and marmalade at breakfast. But our anonymous news article is different. Firstly, it's not recent news. The incident reported took place the previous summer. And secondly, although a local village is named, this is not about tea parties, sporting endeavours, nor funerals. The headline reads, Houghton Ruins, a visitor and a ghost. It's a travel piece with a haunted twist. And here's a summary or retelling of what this intrepid travel writer experienced. On a glorious August day in 1922, I travelled south from Bedford in a rather rickety motorcar to the village of Houghton. My driver that day was rather keen on getting me to Houghton quickly, and I was hurtled about, almost falling out of the motor onto the dusty road at several points. But on arriving in Houghton village in one piece, tranquillity descended. The birds chirped lazily in the deep green branches overhead. The air was heavy with the scent of summer, and in the distance I could hear the swish of the scythe. I came to a quaint old inn where the village gathered after a day's work was complete. I sauntered into the bar and was soon chatting with the landlord and his friends over brimming tankards of Bedfordshire beer. I inquired about the village and its history, which those gathered were glad to talk about. I have a particular interest in ruins, and so naturally wondered if there was any nearabouts. The landlord nodded. Yes, there was a ruin of an old manor house up on the hill, looking over Houghton, towards Ampthill. I enthusiastically announced my plans to visit them that very evening. It was then that I noticed the faces around me were etched with uneasiness. Frowns had replaced the congenial smiles of a moment ago. I'm not a superstitious person, But I asked the landlord if there were any stories connected with these ruins. The landlord picked up a tankard and began to polish it with a rag in a rather distracted manner. Folks do say those ruins is haunted, on nights, especially when the moon's full, and she will be tonight, I dare say. The assembled regulars nodded their agreement solemnly as they stared into their tankards. I've heard tell that years ago, maybe 50, 60 or possibly more, there were people living there. It had been empty for some time at that point. You'd have only moved there if you were down on your luck, or wanting a cheap and very private accommodation. It was not in a good state of repair, but it was far away from other houses. It was a young couple who came to live there. The lass was a sunny young thing, all smiles when she did come into the village, which wasn't as often as many would have liked. She was the kind of lass who brightened up your day. Her hair was golden and her face like that of a doll. And she was a kind soul. But the husband, well, he was different. My father told me how he witnessed this man kicking his own dogs and slashing at his horse. And that tells you what kind of man he was. The village feared for this poor young bride, but when she did come into the village, she was all smiles, and so everyone assumed he did not extend his cruelty towards her. That same summer, a new doctor came to Houghton, a young man trained in London, about the same age as the couple, up in the manor house. He was called out to the manor one afternoon when the husband was ailing with something or other. After that, villagers would often see the doctor heading up that way, though the couple always seemed to be in good health. The landlord paused. He glanced around the bar and then back at me, lowering his voice. Nobody knows anything else but this. These are the facts. One late August afternoon, one of those end-of-summer days where the sky is heavy and grey above the golden stubbled fields, when the wind shifts uneasily through the deep green leaves of the trees, 2 dead bodies were found in a field alongside the manor. They were the brutally murdered bodies of that young doctor and the bonny lass. The husband disappeared. He was never seen again. All in the inn gathered around the bar with me bowed their heads. Then one of the old farmers spoke up. I remember a time when I was young, maybe 40 years back, that Farmer Burden told me he had been coming across those fields there, by the manor, for quickness' sake for getting home, when he heard a rustling and a moaning coming from those ruins. He never believed in ghosts, old Burden, but he did after that. He's not the only one either. Remember when that young squire came dashing into the bar here that night, looking as white as a sheet and staggering as if he was drunk? There was a nod of agreement in remembering this out-of-ordinary occurrence. He wouldn't say what the matter was at first, just that he'd had a fall coming over the hills past the ruins. But after a brandy or two, he seemed to settle, and he claimed there was more to those ruins than any of us know. Cryptic he was, but we knew what he meant. The ghost. It's as if the poor young girl's spirit is wandering up there, maybe afraid her husband will come back. It's not a place to go after dark. Sensible folk do avoid it. I had made up my mind, though, to visit that spot which caused such excitement locally. Those gathered tried to dissuade me, but I was adamant. I took my leave and promised to be back by midnight. The sun was gradually sinking, and as I climbed the slopes of the hillside towards the ruins, I turned back to look across the valley now bathed in golden glow. It was a glorious sight. The clouds splashed with crimson. I saw a decrepit old windmill transformed as it stood out in black relief against the brilliant sky. Dark woods glowed burnished bronze until the sun slipped away completely, and I shivered as shadows slinked across the valley. I returned to my walk, and the going got steeper. On occasions I did catch a glimpse of the ruins partly hidden by the trees. At last, I scrambled up onto a fairly flat piece of grassland. There I came across an avenue of great oak trees, though some were just blackened skeletal remains, struck dead by lightning. Silhouetted against the pale mauve sky, they gave a stately impression. Making my way through this grand avenue, I reached the summit of the hill, and there in front of me was the ruined manor. The ruins were jagged against the sky. A full moon had risen, and its light cast strange shadows from the trees onto the bricks that remained of the manor. Ivy clung to much of what was left, but some of the glassless windows were free of foliage, and stars began to shine through those gaps. I made my way to what had once been the grand entrance to the house. I paused in the doorway. Directly opposite, through the ruins, was another doorway, tall and arched, with a view out onto the valley beyond. I stepped inside the ruins and disturbed an owl. I can tell you my heart leapt out of my chest, as if it wished to escape. I chuckled to myself once the beating eased. That was just an old owl, I told myself. No doubt there were bats too. I was drawn towards that view across the valley. I walked carefully across the ground towards the opposite wall. There were bricks strewn and brambles rambling, but the ruins must have been visited fairly regularly, as there was a path which had been trodden through the undergrowth towards that other doorway. I stood on the lip of that opening and looked out. The valley below was vast, stretching all the way to Bedford. Pale spots of streetlights dotted the valley amongst deep pools of darkness. A steam train trundled below. It was a still night, and the sound of the train came eerily close. Mist was also rising from the valley, glowing in the moonlight in banks and drifts. I did not want to have to walk back to the inn through fog, but it seemed a waste to leave so soon just because of some mist. I took a step outside the ruin, and a fox, or possibly small deer, must have been disturbed as I heard its retreat into the undergrowth to my left. I fished around in my pockets for my pipe and tobacco, but just as I was about to start filling my pipe, I heard the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping below a foot. It came from behind me, from inside the ruin. I froze. I listened keenly, pipe still in hand. I slowly turned my head to look over my shoulder into the dark interior of the former manor house. There I saw it, a shadow dart from that well-worn path into the deeper shade. I was certain of it, a person for sure, not an animal. I spun around, standing in that gaping wound of a doorway, staring into the darkness of the ruin. "Who's there?" I yelled. "Show yourself, man!" But there was silence. Although I was attempting to sound stern, inside I felt like jelly. I told myself it was possibly just a young man on a ramble, or possibly a poacher. This was not the location to come and rob someone. Not unless someone at the inn had tipped them off. I shook my head. No, that was fanciful thinking. After some minutes, I began to doubt myself. Nothing stirred within the ruins, no sounds, no shadows, but I did not wish to step inside that place again. Just standing on the edge of the ruins, I felt like a kind of charge was coming from within its broken walls. A dark, buzzing energy. I began to walk around the edge of the ruin, skirting the perimeter, peering through the ragged windows and open arches, but no one could I see. I reached the front of the ruined manor once more, and from some distance looked back towards it. Something caught my eye. In the large gaping window above the front door, something moved. Not a bat, nor an owl. It was a face, staring out at me, a pale face, etched in misery. But there was no upper floor to these ruins. You could not look through that space unless you could fly. I turned and I ran. As I did so, the most horrendous wailing cry came from inside the ruins behind me. I wanted to cover my ears like a child. I ran and ran back through those trees. The lightning-struck ones seemed to point at me now with jagged accusations of coward. I ran back to the hillside to scramble down that path. Once I was out of the sight of the ruins, I rested, my breath ragged and broken. It was then I caught my breath that I saw it, stumbling blindly down the hillside towards me, glowing white in the moonlight. I'm ashamed to say, I screamed, and the creature mooed back at me. It was a young cow. I began to chuckle. The creature stopped just above me, and it took a turn into the thicket and began to munch at something in the undergrowth. I could perhaps believe that this runaway bovine was what had stepped on a twig in the ruins. Maybe even its shadow had fooled me into thinking it was a man. But unless this cow could fly and transform its face into that of a grief-stricken woman, then I could not explain everything that I experienced that night at the ruins. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. I'm Nat Doig, and today I'm going to be exploring some of Bedfordshire's haunted ruins and former castles. From the stories swirling around Houghton House to the site of one of Henry VIII's favourite castles in Ampthill Great Park, and to the site of Biggleswade's former castle. There are plenty of ghost stories to explore along the way, with the history of some of the county's most remarkable buildings, which we have lost, or almost lost, over the centuries. This episode will then lead us into our next one about abandoned places in Bedfordshire and the Black Death. I originally intended this just to be one episode covering all of this, but as I uncovered more stories and places, I worried how I was going to fit everything in. Then I was unwell for a lot of last week, so it made sense to make 2 episodes. It's funny how things turn out for the best in the end. And just a quick reminder that the show I've created with Ollie Campbell, Bedfordshire's Dark History, is on at the Bedford Fringe Festival on Saturday the 25th of July at 2 p.m. at the Quarry Theatre in Bedford. And if you're fast, you can probably still snap up a few last-minute tickets to come and see our show. It covers the stories of Black Tom, the phantom highwayman of Bedford, and Clophill's ruined church, the Black Magic Church on the hill. It's a real mixture of me telling creepy ghost stories and folk tales, and Ollie has composed some new haunting and beautiful songs to accompany those stories. So yes, do grab tickets. Get your hands on those last few tickets to come and see Bedfordshire's Dark History. I will pop a link in the show description wherever you're listening now. Have a look where you can find out more and get tickets. And also I will pop a link on the show blog. And of course, it's not just us performing at Bedford Fringe. There are so many fantastic shows that are on over the next few days in Bedford. It starts on Wednesday. There is a day celebrating inclusive theatre and disability arts, which you really won't want to miss on the Wednesday. And then there's comedy, there's live music, there's podcast related shows like ours. It's just going to be wonderful. So running from Wednesday all the way through to Sunday. So yes, if you are able to get to Bedford on Saturday, the 25th of July, come and see us at 2 p.m. Ollie and I would love to see you. Before we get on with the rest of today's episode, I just wanted to thank you again for getting in touch. Whether it was to say how much you enjoyed our LGBTQ plus Pride episode last time, or by sending me in your road ghost stories. I do intend to make another episode about road ghosts, which will come out in the autumn or winter later this year. I do love hearing from you. And remember, you can email me at weirdinthewade@gmail.com or get in touch on social media. We're everywhere. Facebook, Insta, TikTok even. So yes, you can look for us on social media too. And please do keep getting in touch. Again, I'm sorry if I don't respond to every email immediately. I do read them all. But I've just been very, very busy over the last few weeks planning these episodes that will be coming out over the summer. The ruins of Houghton House have certainly been a popular visitors' attraction for the last 200 years. And in a moment, Bryan Bland, yes, Bryan from the Cooper's Hill episode, who is now Ampthill's town crier, as well as being Ampthill's ghost walk expert, is going to tell us the real history of that crumbling old manor house and some of its ghostly folklore. But what of this story in the newspaper that I opened today's episode with? Well, as I mentioned, it is an anonymous article, and I'm assuming it was seen as a fictional ghost story and travel piece. I'm unsure if anyone did really visit the ruins and get spooked by a cow, although that was highly possible. And I'll admit now that I did add the face at the window section because I thought it needed something more frightening to make a grown man run away from the house, rather than just hearing a twig snap and seeing a shadow. One thing is for sure though, the ghost story told by that landlord cannot be true. Even 70 years prior to 1922, the house was in ruins. And no one, even a desperate couple, would have been able to live there unless they camped out. There was no roof on the house. Bryan will explain to us shortly how it became a ruin. But as early as 1837, parties were being held in the ruins for local children in the summertime. It was also a popular cross-country running destination around the same time. Cross-country running became so popular in the first half of the 19th century, it was quite the craze. Later in the 1870s and 80s, the ruins were used for annual rifle shooting competitions and military camps. It seems there were concerns at the same time about cattle overrunning and destroying the ruined house. One poor cow even got shot during rifle practice. So maybe it is plausible that a visitor was startled by a cow. I don't think the cows were moved away from the ruins until well into the 20th century. And concerns about how to preserve the ruins came to a head just months after that ghost story appeared in the local newspaper in the summer of 1923. The land had been bought by someone who wanted to demolish the ruins. It took over a decade to secure the monument's survival, though, and today the site is run by English Heritage. I popped over to Ampthill Great Park to catch up with Bryan Bland and ask him about Houghton House. But as we were meeting in the park, we started our discussion with Ampthill Castle. The two buildings, Houghton House and the castle, briefly stood together on the green sand ridge, looking down onto the Vale of Bedford. And I'll be telling you more about the ghosts of Ampthill Castle and Great Park later in this episode. So let's head over to Bryan and hear what he has to say.
I'm Bryan Bland and I run Ampthill Ghost Walks, which I'm really passionate about, which basically means I gather interested people around Ampthill Market Square and tell them some wonderful spooky stories about our haunted history.
Fantastic. And I have been on one of these walks and I can say they are amazing. Really, really creepy and atmospheric, but you learn an awful lot too. But today we're in Ampthill Great Park.
Ampthill and Bedfordshire are really lucky and fortunate to have Ampthill Great Park. For a lot of people, they don't realise exactly what's here and what its history is. For a start, it was much, much bigger than it is now. It was a vast hunting ground, eventually for Henry VIII. And he was really passionate about Ampthill. There's a lot of research to show that Henry came here many times, and in fact, he brought every one of his 6 wives here, much to his court's distaste, because of course, he had quite a history with his wives. And there's a really excellent story in the records about him having to continuously get the stained glass installer back to change the faces of his brides in the bedroom, right? Here in Ampthill, right? Because in the middle of Ampthill Great Park was Ampthill Castle, which was like a Jacobean palace. It was about 200 foot square with 11 towers and just like a mini Hampton Court. And if it was still
not
here...
Not that mini either.
No, you're right. But Henry VIII loved Ampthill and brought each of his 6 wives here. But interestingly, Catherine of Aragon, he imprisoned here, he incarcerated here for 33 years whilst he got his divorce through, which was finally signed at Dunstable Priory. So it's amazing, his relationship with Ampthill was over many, many years. And he'd ride out across the Bedford Vale, and there was another hunting lodge right over at Brogborough in the distance, and he would ride to that. Here in Ampthill itself, the park went right round the town over towards the east, and it went out of the town towards the north, and you get places like Little Park Farm. Okay. We are in Great Park, yes. But Little Park Farm was part of Ampthill Park as well. So yeah, it's got a fantastic history around Henry VIII and Ampthill Castle, which is now long gone, buried deep under the ground. This summer actually we had an archaeological dig, the 3rd dig I believe over the years, and that had some incredible results establishing exactly how far the castle stretched. Over Henry VIII's time, the park was a massive garden for Ampthill House, and it was laid out by Capability Brown. And there are still some ancient oaks in Ampthill Park that go back to that time when Capability Brown completely remodelled the park.
On the same ridge that we're on, there is another big house, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Although, very sadly, it's now a ruin.
Ampthill Castle was built in about 1450, but if we go forward a bit, you're right, we come to Houghton House, which was constructed around about 1615 for the Countess of Pembrokeshire. And the sad thing is, she couldn't actually enjoy it. She only lived in it for 9 short years before dying quite young herself. And Houghton House is now a standing ruin. So unlike Ampthill Castle, which is completely gone except for its buried foundations, Houghton House is this marvellous romantic ruin in the landscape overlooking the countryside, as you say. It's got an even more intriguing and slightly sorrowful history, to be honest. The house went through a number of families' ownership. For example, it was a stronghold during the Civil War as well, and it inspired John Bunyan with House Beautiful in Pilgrim's Progress, right? But it was a Cavalier stronghold and a sort of Jacobean outpost for the Stuarts on 2 different occasions. So it went through many, many different hands, but it ended up in the Duke of Bedford's hands, and he was actually born in the house, but yet again, his parents died quite young, which was quite shocking. And then, of course, it got left to the Duke of Bedford. And he decided on a bit of a whim, because he associated it with his parents' untimely death, to take the roof off in 1793.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it only stood for 180 years, even though it's the most splendid and magnificent of houses. The architecture is superb. It's got column porticos and it would have had massive windows. It would have been quite something in its day. But yeah, on a whim, he took the roof off and he sold off the panelling, some of which you can still find in a farmhouse in Haynes called Manor Farm.
Amazing.
The staircase ended up in the Swan Hotel in Bedford. The gates and urns are outside a house, funnily enough, called the Gatehouse, in Church Street in Ampthill. So there are parts of its interiors still around, but he destroyed it in a whim, and it just basically fell into disrepair. It became known as Houghton Ruins, interestingly, and it also was a bit of a pilgrimage for people interested in the Romantic movement. So whether it was the Duke of Bedford himself, in the Regency and Victorian ages, people would go to Houghton House with their lovers. They would carve their names in the columns and in the bricks, announcing their true love, and dating it. And it's incredible. You can still see dates from the 1800s, late 1800s, easily in the stonework of Houghton House. There's no evidence to say that that was his intention, but it definitely became Houghton Ruins, and it definitely became a pilgrimage for people from that Romantic movement.
It does have a bit of a spooky history as well, doesn't it, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, you're not kidding. I mean, so, wow, where do we start? Throughout the families that were there, it had some turbulent times. There's local legend and a fantastic ghost story from 1915. So the driveway came down into Ampthill, what is now known as Gashouse Lane. So it's still there, it comes down into the town. Halfway up is a very old farm that was part of Houghton House. In 1915, the daughter of the farmer had been working in the bomb factories that used to be Vauxhall in Luton, and she'd gone to do her shift in the bomb factories by train. She came home to Ampthill station by train. Train station was open in Ampthill at that time, and then she walked home. And as she was walking up the carriage drive, she heard horses' hooves, the jangling of all of the harnesses, the thundering of the wheels. So much so, she threw herself into a hedge backwards and felt the air rush by as the carriage rushed by her towards Houghton House. She actually could not understand why she couldn't see a carriage because she heard it and she even felt it go by. There's then legend about how that happened around an attack on one of the residents of Houghton House in the past, who was attacked by a stranger from the back of her cab, who was then shot in the courtyard of Houghton House. And all the stables in the courtyard, if you visit Houghton House, they were actually to the right, and they're now replaced by a much more modern house, about 300 years old. One of the common things that is reported at Houghton House is the feeling of being watched or the feeling of being followed as you're going around the ruins. When the paranormal investigations have taken place, including mediums, they've detected a number of different spirits, and most notably quite a threatening spirit. At one point, I believe Luton Paranormal Society captured the words "get out" on a recorder. So it's always had this kind of dark side to it. The other thing that people have often reported is dark shadows. If you go online and you Google Houghton House, and there's quite a lot on YouTube of urbex explorers and paranormal explorers doing videos of Houghton House, but there's also a lot of photographies of shadows in windows. And I've actually had experience of that myself.
I was going to say.
I ran into a guy at an event. It was actually a comedy night at Parkside Hall in Ampthill, who recognised me from my ghost walks because he had been observing me in Church Street doing my ghost walks outside a flat that he was renting. And this guy's name was Rod Knox. So Rod explained to me that when he left the forces, he wanted to start a photography business, showing people doing what they loved. So if you played the piano, he'd come and photograph you at your piano. If you loved your car, your Lamborghini or your classic car, he'd come and photograph you with your car. And he said, I really would love to do a photo shoot of you around your ghost walks. I was quite flattered and also a bit bashful, but I said, okay, let's do it. So we agreed to do this photo shoot on the 15th of January. and Rod chose the location. So that's important. It wasn't me. I arranged to pick him up at 3:45 on the Saturday the 15th of January, and it was just getting dark, so that we had some light for the start of the photo shoot, moving into darkness. We went up to Houghton House, which was his suggestion. He took a number of photos of me, different poses, which was all very amusing, and it was a great photo shoot, and it was very kind of him. And I've got some great kind of portfolio shots I sometimes use on my developing website and my Facebook page. One shot he wanted was me sitting in a window. So I sat in the window. He had his camera on a tripod. It was not windy or raining, although it was later, but it wasn't at that point in time. His camera was a very, very modern camera. I think it was a Pentax. It had digital camera with software, had facial recognition, zoomed in on whatever you set it to, humans, pets, flowers, and in my case, human, of course. And it also had infrared on it, right? So it couldn't fail to focus on me sitting in this window. It would not focus. Instead, it focused behind me in the house. He managed to get 3 photos, first photo of which shows a very dark blob behind me. I'm completely out of focus, which doesn't make any sense. The second picture, that dark blob looks as if it's moved closer and is in more of what you could perceive as a human shape. You can actually see a head and shoulders with the windows behind, And then the final shot, it's very close to me, and yet again, it's all out of focus, and the bricks are all out of focus, and it's as if the camera is moving, which of course it wasn't. And he could not, I mean, it was quite amusing for me. He was getting really frustrated with this wonderful, really expensive camera because he couldn't focus it. In the end, he did get the shot he needed, and to this day, Rod swears he can't explain why the software failed. It never failed before. There was an earlier shot we took where I was standing against a wall when it was quite light, where he said it kept wanting to focus on a humanoid shape to the left of me. Which was also really, really strange. When I posted these shots up on my Facebook page, 3 or 4 other people also posted pictures of dark shapes in windows at Houghton House, or dark shapes in the house itself.
And yes, if anyone listening has had a similar experience while trying to take photographs at Houghton House, please let us know. Or anywhere else, in any other spooky place where you've had a similar experience. It'd be amazing to see those photographs. Thank you so much, Bryan, for sharing that with us. Those are amazing stories. Thank you.
No problem.
Having been lucky enough to visit Houghton House in the dark, I can vouch for its strange atmosphere come nightfall. Now, there are private houses up near the ruin now, and the site is managed by English Heritage, so access at night is not advised. I personally found the walk beneath the avenue of trees approaching the ruins to be creepier than the actual house itself. But even visiting in daylight when there is a lull in visitors, or even often none at all, is equally spellbinding. Taking in that view across Bedford is a rare treat in Bedfordshire as well. The ruins have stairs going down into what were kitchens, so there's more to explore than just an empty shell on one level. The sighting of shadows flitting around the ruins does seem to be a fairly common report. Of course, there are all kinds of physical reasons why a ruined building like Houghton House will cast shadows, what with its ragged walls and gaping windows. The trees nearby also create dappled shade, which can just add to that atmosphere of random movement. I'll link on the show blog to the photos that Bryan mentioned, and do let me know what you make of them. There's also a great blog entry from Knock Once for Yes podcast about their visit to Houghton House, which I will also link to. I'd love to know if any of you have ever experienced anything strange and uncanny whilst visiting Houghton House. There's a very short ad break coming up, and thank you for listening to the adverts. They do help the show keep going. But if you would like to get Weird in the Wade advert free, then check out our Patreon. For the price of a frothy coffee per month, you can get advert-free episodes of Weird in the Wade and bonus material. But either way, thank you for listening to the adverts now, as it really does help the show.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. Listening to this podcast instead of doom scrolling? Smart move. Another smart move? Getting help from one of State Farm's 19,000 local agents when you choose to bundle home and auto. Bundling, just another way to save with the Personal Price Plan. Prices are based on rating plans that vary by state. Coverage options are selected by the customer. Availability, amount of discounts and savings, and eligibility vary by state.
Experience a membership that backs what you're building with American Express Business Platinum. Enjoy complimentary access to the American Express Global Lounge Collection and apply to find out your welcome offer, which could be as high as 300,000 membership rewards points. American Express Business Platinum. There's nothing like it. Terms apply. Welcome offers vary and you may not be eligible for an offer. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-platinum.
Chevy is called the heartbeat of America for a reason. With SUVs made to move with your rhythm. The versatile Equinox tackles your entire day. The spacious Traverse fits your crew and your whole weekend. And Trax brings style with value you can count on. All infused with tech that has your back, so your drive always hits the right chord. Chevrolet. Together, let's drive.
Although Houghton House currently stands in glorious isolation, for a short time in its history it stood alongside Ampthill Castle, about a mile or so along the Green Sand Ridge. In fact, the Green Sand Way walking route links the two as part of the John Bunyan Trail, if you fancy walking it. When Houghton House was a brand new Jacobean mansion, Ampthill Castle, unfortunately, was already in ruins. Although Henry VIII was fond of this castle at Ampthill, as Bryan has told us earlier, and used it as a hunting lodge, by the time his daughter Mary is on the throne in 1555, the castle is in disrepair. And I can see why Mary may have had little interest in fixing the place up, as it was where her mother Catherine of Aragon was sent during Henry's divorce proceedings against her. So within 20 years of Catherine's imprisonment there, the grand octagonal towers and roofs were looking more than a little worse for wear. By the early 17th century, there are reports of the townsfolk of Ampthill using masonry from the castle to build their own homes. One report explains that the local inhabitants were not just intent on poaching game from the park. By the time of the English Civil War, the castle is no more, according to the records. Then we fast forward to the 18th century and Horace Walpole enters our story. Yes, the politician and writer. Horace Walpole, who wrote the very first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto. He is interested in the old castle at Ampthill, and in particular Catherine of Aragon. You can see why the man who invented the Gothic novel was interested in the tragedy and melodrama of the wives of Henry VIII. His good friend Lord Ossory owned Ampthill Great Park, which had been landscaped by Capability Brown. Like any self-respecting nobleman, Lord Ossory was keen for his grounds to stand out as different and unique. Walpole suggested that a Gothic cross be erected in memory of Catherine, and he even wrote a letter to Ossory explaining that one of the only remnants of the castle that still existed was Catherine's garden. Now, I'm not sure what this garden entailed. Some bushes, roses maybe, or a few stones from a wall. But it was suggested by Walpole that this Gothic cross should be erected on the site of the old garden. Ossory thought it a splendid idea, and in 1773 the cross was finished. On its base is the following poem by Horace Walpole, which I believe I may have read out before on the show. In days of old, here Amptill's towers were seen, the mournful refuge of an injured queen. Here flowed her pure but unavailing tears. Here blinded zeal sustained her sinking years. Yet freedom hence her radiant banner waved, and love avenged a realm of priests enslaved. From Catherine's wrongs a nation's bliss was spread, and Luther's light from Henry's lawless bed. Walpole turns Catherine into a kind of misguided martyr or sacrificial lamb for the English church, something I'm sure that she would not agree with. For Walpole, Queen Catherine is wronged by Henry, and she is admirably steadfast in her own Roman Catholicism, but Walpole sees the pain and hurt that she endured as a necessary evil for the English to adopt Protestantism. I am glad that that cross was erected in the memory, though, of Catherine of Aragon, because she's such a compelling figure. who I feel was written off in earlier history as simply the stubborn Spanish one of Henry's wives. All of the wives of Henry VIII have been reassessed and re-examined in recent decades by historians and the media. I remember being taught and reading about history back in the 1980s where Henry killing 2 of his wives was seen as almost amusing. Like, what a brute he was, but hey, what a lad, 6 wives, ho-ho. We tended to not think about historical figures as actual people. Their psychology and relationships seemed less important than their grand deeds. Thankfully, that is changing. Because I was an adult when it finally struck me that one of the main reasons why Elizabeth I chose to not marry was likely because her mother had been murdered by her father. What did that tell her about husbands? And husbands who would be kings? I don't blame her for keeping away from them. Can you imagine it? I think there's been a tendency to think, oh, those Tudors executing people left, right and centre, like it was normal for the time. But that's not really the whole story. What Henry VIII did by executing 2 of his wives and divorcing 2 others was utterly extreme, even for the time, even for a king. The whole of Europe was abuzz with it. It was scandalous. And of course, Henry's wives weren't the only 2 queens to be executed by the Tudor monarchs. There's Lady Jane Grey and then Mary Queen of Scots later. But Henry was the one who started it. Before that time, kings were generally killing each other in battle, not beheading their wives. But back to Catherine. I wondered if she had a ghost. I'm well aware of several places that boast of Anne Boleyn's restless spirit and of Catherine Howard's. And it turns out that yes, Catherine of Aragon's ghost is said to haunt a castle, just not Ampthill Castle or its great park. In fact, it turns out that many believe that Catherine of Aragon's phantom haunts the head teacher's office of a school that a friend of mine's children attend. Henry VIII's divorce was eventually granted. It took 3 years and it was largely sorted out at Dunstable Priory, which is why Queen Catherine was kept close by at Ampthill. And there is a connection to Biggleswade. One of the delegates at the Priory who sought to prove the illegality of the marriage was a Simon Matthew, also known as Simon Core, of Biggleswade. Now, it seems that this Simon Matthew was from a wealthy Biggleswade family. He attended Eton as a boy, the public school, before he graduated from King's College, Cambridge in 1529 with a Bachelor's of Divinity. He was ordained a vicar and he worked at Prescott, Lancashire for a while and then at Tolsbury, Essex. He then became rector of Mary Woolchurch in London and then canon of St Paul's. His final job was as rector of St Botolph's, Bishopsgate, a year after Henry's divorce or annulment was reached. Maybe this final position at St Botolph's was a thank you to Simon for siding with Henry at Dunstable Priory. Simon Matthew died in 1541, probably around the age of 47. But back to Catherine. Once the marriage was legally over, she was sent on house arrest to Kimbolton Castle. Now, Kimbolton is 25 miles northeast of Ampthill, just over the Bedfordshire border into Huntingdonshire. In 1535, the castle was a Tudor manor, though its origins go back to the Normans. Unfortunately, the current mansion, which is beautiful at Kimbolton, dates back to the 18th century, though parts of the Tudor building do remain inside. Catherine's ghost is said to haunt the Queen's chambers, which is appropriate enough. As the castle is no longer a private home but a school, these chambers are now the head teacher's office. What is strangely peculiar about this haunting, though, is that the ghost seen, a woman in Tudor dress, floats or glides across 2 floors. You see, the ceiling or floor, depending on which room you're in, cuts her body in 2. Now, I'm not sure if it's her flowing skirts or her head and shoulders that are seen in the head teacher's office, but it seems she's the type of spectre who is pacing the floors of a previous layout of the building. One of those rewind and replay kind of ghosts. I have not found any actual eyewitness accounts yet of this phantom, though the story is very well known and frequently reported, and not just by the current students at the school. Kimbolton Castle does hold open days, and the next one is in the autumn, so if you want to go and have a look for the ghost yourself, go along to Kimbolton Castle on an open day. But of course, although Catherine of Aragon may not haunt Ampthill's Great Park, that does not mean that the park is ghost story free. The park now is a beautiful space to visit with woodland, open grassland, sports facilities, great views and a coffee shop. And of course, Queen Catherine's Cross. It's opposite Cooper's Hill, which we covered on an episode last year. The most frequently sighted ghost in Ampthill Great Park could potentially be Tudor, or possibly date back to the site's earlier medieval origins. Since the early 20th century, there have been reports of a knight in shining armour with a colourful shield and a long, sharp lance riding out from Catherine's Cross across the park. Now, this knight sounds like a medieval jousting knight, maybe even Henry VIII in his younger days. He's described as bold and looking solid, not like a ghost. But other sightings of the knight report him as being more ethereal and mistier. It's as if the apparition is sometimes clear and sometimes translucent, waxing and waning in visibility and substance. But this horse and rider have been seen by both policemen and soldiers who were stationed nearby during the First World War, not the kinds of witnesses that usually choose to make things up or draw attention to themselves. But it seems that there may be more than one horse and rider trampling the ground of Ampthill Great Park, as others swear the horse and rider seen is not in full armour, but is dressed in highwayman's garb. Sometimes this phantom rider is also said to be headless. Some locals believe that they know the identity of this phantom and claim he is Galloping Dick, the highwayman. Millbrook is Galloping Dick's phantom's usual stomping ground, where it's claimed the hooves of his horse are heard at night, and Millbrook is just to the west of Ampthill Great Park. When I was a guest on the Lawman podcast last year, I told Galloping Dick's tale. One of the things that struck me about this highwayman were the number of stories associated with him. He was a real highwayman called Richard Ferguson, born nowhere near Ampthill or Millbrook, over in Herefordshire. He was good with horses and an able rider, which was what gained him his nickname, Galloping Dick. And he and his gang were eventually caught, and the real Richard Ferguson was executed at Aylesbury, so not a million miles away from Ampthill. It appears that he had been robbing people near to Woburn, along that road between Millbrook and Woburn. But after his death, rumours began to swirl, which associated him with Millbrook on the edge of Ampthill Great Park. It was said that Ferguson, when on the run, had hid out for a while in a sand pit in Millbrook. Well, it is on the Green Sand Ridge after all. Others disputed that he had even died by execution, claiming instead that he had ridden his horse into a pond and drowned in Millbrook. And if you look on the map of Ampthill Great Park and Millbrook today, that you'll see there are a number of ponds between the Great Park and Millbrook. His ghost began to bother the inhabitants at Millbrook in the early 20th century when clattering hooves were heard at night, but no living horse could be seen to be making the noise. So I can see why a horse and rider glimpsed on a dark night riding out of the park west towards Millbrook could be interpreted as being the ghost of Galloping Dick, but not if he was clad in armour. It's a fascinating story either way, and if you want to hear more about Galloping Dick, I'll link to the Lawman episode that I guested on in the show notes on weirdinthewade.blog. Biggleswade Castle. What if I told you that Biggleswade also had a castle? Now, those of you familiar with the town might be surprised. Where on earth could that castle be? Well, what if I told you that until 1954, no one in Biggleswade even remembered that there'd been a castle? And I don't think we should be surprised that Biggleswade Castle was forgotten, because it probably only lasted a few decades and was built in the early to mid-12th century. There's a chance that part of the castle existed at the time of the Domesday Book, 1086, but we can't be sure. There is mention of a parcel of land called Castle's Gate in 1423, and that's it for the records. It's very likely that by 1423 the land was just a field, but the name had stuck. So where was the castle, and how was it discovered? In 1954, aerial photographs taken of Biggleswade showed unusual circular crop markings in a field just to the west of Biggleswade. Currently, this field sits just on the inside edge of the A1 Biggleswade bypass. The crop markings showed unusual ring ditches, and after a more detailed survey and some archaeological digs in the 1960s, this is what the experts have decided. The castle was most probably built during the Anarchy, a period of civil war and the breakdown of law and order in England from 1138 to 1153. Henry I had died without a living son, and so he wanted the English throne, which included much of Norman France as well at the time, to go to his daughter, the Empress Matilda. But Henry's nephew, Matilda's cousin, Stephen de Blois, with help from his brother, who was the Archbishop of Winchester, grabbed the English throne. Half of the barons would not recognise him. The Welsh and the Scots took their chance and invaded England, and then Matilda launched her own attack from the southwest. Whilst Stephen and Matilda fought for control, many barons in the north and east accrued power for themselves in their own local areas. It really was a case of each for his own in some parts of the country. Matilda eventually captured Stephen, but could not get into London to be crowned queen as a hostile crowd fought back. Now, Stephen's wife, another Matilda, just to make things confusing, captured one of Empress Matilda's allies, a Robert of Gloucester, and held him prisoner. So, a prisoner exchange was organised, Stephen for Robert, but still the conflict was not ended, as the released Stephen immediately tried to capture Empress Matilda. Now, she famously is said to have made her escape across a frozen Thames River near Oxford. The unrest was finally quelled when Stephen came to a peace, not with Matilda, who had fled to Normandy, but to her son. Stephen's own son had died of illness, and so without an heir, and with the country tired of war and disorder, Empress Matilda's son, Henry II, became king in 1154. Important strategic areas during all this disruption were actually the supply routes and rivers and roads, including the Thames Valley, and so the River Thames, and routes north from London towards Lincoln. Biggleswade, placed as it is on the River Ivor and the Great North Road, was of some strategic importance, not the town itself, but the river and the road running alongside it. The castle is most likely an anarchy castle built to control movement along that road and river. It's certainly not positioned to defend the town, but instead just to monitor what was going, who was going to and from along the river and road. The castle was a ring, work and bailey castle rather than the more recognisable Motte and Bailey. We'll be looking at a Motte and Bailey castle in the next episode though. The Baileys at Biggleswade were most probably built of wood, though some stone may have been used, and they were surrounded by these ring ditches rather than being perched on top of a mound or a motte. Excavations during the construction of the A1 bypass found 12th century pottery sherds and wattle and daub structures which they thought were used to hold up the ditches which surround the castle. There was a causeway as well built linking the two baileys across these ditches. Now, as the land round about is quite marshy, I'm guessing that these ditches would have been water-filled as moats for much of the time. There is another circular crop mark which part of the castle may have covered, but the archaeologists believe that this is actually the remains of a Bronze Age barrow. Of course, the reason we only have these crop marks and some earthworks remaining is because for the centuries afterwards, those fields were ploughed, and that flattened the land. You can easily walk up to the field today, where the castle once stood. There's a path that takes you there across from Franklin's Mill and the River Ivor. I'll post pictures on the show blog, weirdintheway.blog. I'm not aware of any ghost stories or even folklore about the castle, and it's not surprising because, of course, it was forgotten for so long. But it's still amazing to think that a castle stood there during such a period of turmoil, only for it to sink back into the soil and be forgotten for over 800 years. The castle was likely hurriedly built, possibly adding on to a smaller structure that was already there, and once law and order was restored, well, it was no longer needed. Castles, grand houses, and even villages and towns have been abandoned and forgotten for all kinds of reasons across the English countryside. Biggleswade alone has 2 former adjacent settlements which no longer exist, and both of these former settlements were larger than Biggleswade back in their day. Why didn't they survive? And why did Biggleswade survive? We'll look into that the next time on Weird in the Wade. From modern buildings left to decay because it's too expensive or inconvenient to fix them, to pandemics like the Black Death, wiping out whole communities. Next time on Weird in the Wade, we're going to look at some of Bedfordshire's and the surrounding areas' most compelling abandoned places, from Cainhoe Castle to the village of Kinnock. Why are we drawn to these eerie, forgotten and forsaken places? I'll chat with some urban explorers as well as a local historian about all of this. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to Bryan Bland from Ampthill Ghost Walks for sharing his wonderful stories with us about Ampthill and Houghton House. Thank you for listening to Weird in the Wade. Weird in the Wade was researched, written, presented and produced by me, Nat Doig. Theme music was by Tess Savagir.
Stitch Fix. Stop shopping, get styled.
A+ on the outfit, Miss Turner. You are about to slay parent-teacher conferences.
Oh, these? Just the most perfect fitting jeans my stylist sent me.
Oh, hello, you, who didn't set one foot in a mall and still looks amazing.
Just share your size, style, and budget, and your stylist sends personalized looks right to your door. Stitch Fix. Get started today at stitchfix.com.
To my stylist. This look is dedicated to you. Thank you. Thank you.
Close your eyes, exhale, feel your body relax, and let go of whatever you're carrying today.
Well, I'm letting go of the worry that I wouldn't get my new contacts in time for this class. I got them delivered free from 1-800-CONTACTS. Oh my gosh, they're so fast.
And breathe.
Oh, sorry. I almost couldn't breathe when I saw the discount they gave me on my first order. Oh, sorry. Namaste.
Visit 1-800-CONTACTS.com today to save on your first order.
1-800-CONTACTS.